So apparently The Last of Us Part 3 might actually be happening. And if it's real, then Naughty Dog has a massive challenge ahead of them. Because no matter where you stand on The Last of Us Part 2, whether you think it's a masterpiece or a mess, one thing is obvious: the fanbase is divided. And that puts Naughty Dog in a really weird position, because Part 3 can't just be good. It has to rebuild trust, win people back, and somehow tell a story that feels true to what made The Last of Us work in the first place, without just playing it safe. Before you can even talk about what The Last of Us Part 3 should do, you have to really be clear about what the series is. Because I think a lot of division around The Last of Us Part 2 comes from people wanting fundamentally different things from it. And to be clear, I'm someone who actually likes Part 2. I think it's ambitious, I think parts of it are incredible, but I also completely understand why it didn't work for a lot of people. Because the original game does something very specific. At its core, it's not about the world or the infection or even survival, it's about building a bond between two characters, and more importantly, between the player and those characters. Everything in that game is in service of that. The pacing, the structure, the quiet moments, it all exists to make you care about Joel and Ellie in a way that feels almost effortless. Part 2 doesn't ignore that, but it completely reframes it. It takes that attachment and turns it into something more uncomfortable. It asks what happens when that bond leads to violence, to obsession, to consequences you can't undo. And for some players that really worked, but for others, it feels like a betrayal of what they were emotionally invested in. And I don't think that's just people not getting it. I think it's because the series shifted from asking you to love these characters to asking you to question why you ever did. So if Part 3 is real, that's the tension it has to deal with. Is this a series about connection or about deconstructing it? Because trying to do both again in the same way is probably the fastest way to divide the people all over again. If The Last of Us Part 3 is going to land, it has to take a good hard look at The Last of Us Part 2 and be honest about what worked and what didn't, not just creatively but in how it treated its audience. Because even though I like Part 2, there's one area where I think it genuinely did cross a line, and that's the way it handled the marketing. The trailers were not just vague, they were deliberately deceptive. Key scenes were altered, characters were swapped, the game was presented as something more familiar, more aligned with the first game's dynamic than it actually was, and you can try and justify that by saying it protected major story moments, but there's a difference between protecting a twist and selling people an experience that isn't really what they're going to get. And for a lot of players that mattered, not because they couldn't handle the story, but because the foundation of trust was already shaky before they even picked up the controller. That is not something Part 3 can afford to repeat at all. You can keep secrets, you should keep secrets, but you don't need to mislead people to do that. Because once players start questioning whether what they're being shown is real, every reveal hits very differently. So if Part 3 wants to rebuild trust, it starts there. At the center of whether The Last of Us Part 3 works or not is a very simple question. Who are we actually following? Because one of the biggest structural risks in The Last of Us Part 2 wasn't just the story that it told, it was the way it asked players to constantly re-anchor their emotional investment. You start with Ellie, then you're forced into Abby's perspective, and for a lot of players, that shift either deepened the experience or completely broke it. And I think it's important to say, Abby works for a lot of people, Lev works for a lot of people. That side of the story isn't wrong or invalid, it's just divisive in how it's delivered and when it's delivered. But if you're thinking about Part 3, I don't think you can build another experience that fractures focus in the same way. Because the emotional center of this franchise, whether you like it or not, is Ellie. Her arc is the one players have been carrying since the first game. Her history, her immunity, her connection to Joel, it's the spine of the entire series. So Part 3 has to commit, it has to follow her. That doesn't mean completely ignoring Abby or Lev. In fact, a short parallel sequence with them could work, especially if it's used sparingly, meaningfully, and not in a way that competes with Ellie's story. But the mistake would be repeating Part 2's structural gamble, where the player is constantly asked to reevaluate who the story is about midstream. And where Ellie's story goes is obviously the big question. For me personally, the most compelling direction is resolution, not in a clean Hollywood way, but in a way that finally moves her beyond being defined entirely by loss and violence. Because if this series is ever going to justify its own emotional weight, it can't just keep accumulating trauma. It has to eventually ask, what does healing even look like in this world? And if there's a path forward that involves Ellie using what she is, the immunity, the significance of it, then that doesn't need to be a cure solves everything type of ending, but it does need to feel like forward motion, like meaning emerging from everything that's been taken, with that famous line, it can't all be for nothing. There's also something here that Naughty Dog hasn't really resolved, and that's the multiplayer project, because people forget just how close that actually felt. This wasn't some vague idea in early development, this was years of work, concept art, interviews, full evolution of the original Factions game. and everything we heard about it sounded incredible, and then it just disappeared. Officially, it's on hold or cancelled depending on how you read it, but either way, from the outside, it looks like something that got very far along and then got pulled back at the last minute, and that is a damn shame. Not just because people wanted more Last of Us, but because this felt like a very different way to engage with the world. So if we're talking about how to not fuck up Part 3, or the future of the series in general, I think this is a big part of it. Finish what you started, or at least bring some version of it back. I think another big thing gamers don't want is for this game to focus too much on wider social and political issues that we see enough of already in other films and other TV shows. I get that the second game touched on it a bit, and I think it's okay to dive into some nuance here and there, but keep it locked into the story, keep it about the characters. We have enough different shows trying to promote different narratives and movements, and I'm not saying I'm for or against any of them, but I think we can get back to stories just being a story as well. And I think it's only going to piss people off if you try and go down that road, when all people really want to see is resolution to people's journeys, specifically Ellie. And so yeah, keep it grounded in this world, avoid trying to put in too much social commentary. Again, focus on the reasons people fell in love with this game in the first place. It's about bonds, it's about relationships, and it's about what people will do for each other and against each other when everything's falling apart. If The Last of Us Part 3 is real, then this can't just be another chapter, it has to be an ending. Not in the sense that everything gets wrapped up neatly, or that the world suddenly becomes hopeful or safe, but in the sense that it actually resolves something. Because right now, the story, especially Ellie's story, feels unfinished, like it's still searching for meaning after everything it's taken away. And that's why Part 3 doesn't need to reinvent everything, it doesn't need a dozen new factions, a completely new cast, or some massive escalation in scope. It needs focus. It needs to take what already works, what people already care about, and actually bring it to somewhere meaningful. Because this series has already asked a lot of its audience. It's asked players to sit with loss, with violence, with uncomfortable perspectives, with choices that don't have clear answers, so there has to be a payoff to that. Not a happy ending, but a satisfying one. Something that feels like it justifies the journey instead of just extending it. And that's really the core of all of this. Don't try to outdo what came before. Don't try to shock people again. Don't try to prove anything. Just finish the story. Take the characters people are already invested in and give them an ending that feels earned. Because if Naughty Dog gets that right, if they focus on resolution instead of escalation, then they won't just avoid fucking it up, they might actually give this series the ending it deserves. What do you guys think? What should this final game be about? What direction should Neil Druckmann go in? I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Who do you think the main character should be? Should they bring in that multiplayer element? Only time will tell. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.